Andrew Jackson, yes. So having moved from our first president under our present-day Constitution, George Washington, then to John Adams. Of course, George Washington, best known for not only being the first president, but solving many of our nation's problems. And again, setting many of those examples that presidents still follow today. John Adams, best known for his support of the Alien Sedition Acts, which really cost him the second term in the presidency, but also, like Washington, he kept us out of a war with a European power. You have Thomas Jefferson in the Revolution of 1800, marks the first time a new political party had taken power from an old political party in both the House and the Senate, but also in the presidency, the executive branch as well. Jefferson becomes a national hero by purchasing Louisiana, doubles the size of the United States overnight, with about 3 cents an acre. Although his sort of halo is tarnished a little bit because of his trying to keep us out of the European conflicts. He establishes the Embargo Act, which basically says Americans can't send out any of their ships to trade. And of course, that causes widespread economic depression, especially in Federalist New England. But Jackson, of course, so Jefferson, that leaves James Madison. And Madison, best known for leading us into the War of 1812. The first years of that war didn't go very well for the United States, although at the end, thanks to Andrew Jackson, the United States won the Battle of New Orleans, and the war was settled without anybody losing or gaining any land. Plus, with the little arbitration agreement enclosed in the treaty that ends the War of 1812, America and Britain sit down and talk about their problems from then on and don't fight about them. Next came James Monroe, who's best known for his Monroe Doctrine, which told European powers to keep their little grubby hands off North, Central, and South America that were no longer open to further colonization. And then comes the story of Andrew Jackson as we move along here. So 1824, we have 4 men running for president. By this time, there is no other party besides the Democratic Republican. The Federalist Party had died because of its anti-war activity in the War of 1812. And so basically, well, at least technically, each one of these 4 men is a Democratic Republican, but they're representing a different section of the country. So you have John Quincy Adams, who's the son of the second president of the United States, John Adams. John Quincy Adams basically represents New England. So his father had been a Federalist, but John Quincy Adams is a Democratic Republican. You have William Crawford, who had was from the South. He had served in many different capacities in the U.S. government, including being basically Secretary of War. You have Henry Clay, who's from the West. And of course, the West at this time just means you're from the west of the Mississippi River. So Henry Clay is from Missouri. And then you have Andrew Jackson, who's also basically from the West. Henry Clay is from Kentucky, And when I say West, I mean west of the Appalachian Mountains. We're not even there to the Mississippi River there as far as being west of that. But west of the Appalachian Mountains, Henry Clay is from Kentucky, and Andrew Jackson, just to the south of that, is from Tennessee. Henry Clay is best known for, at the time, being Speaker of the House of Representatives. He's the youngest Speaker of the House of Representatives, a person that has a lot of power in the House. He's I think, still the youngest Speaker of the House of Representatives the United States has ever had. And of course, then you have the story of Andrew Jackson, who basically represents the West. So one of the things at the time was, if we look at the list of presidents, and then we look at the list of Secretary of States, you might notice something. And you might notice that basically, for the most part, up until this time, if you were Secretary of State, it looks like you're going to be the President of the United States. So Jefferson, who'd been the Secretary of State under Washington, had become President of the United States. Madison, who was Secretary of State under Adams, became Madison, who'd been Secretary of State under Jefferson, became President of the United States. Monroe, James Monroe, who had been Secretary of State under Madison, becomes President of the United States. Now, of course, Mr. Marshall, who had been Secretary of State under Adams, did not become President of the United States, but he became head of the U.S. Supreme Court, which is a pretty great job in the first place. So if you're John Quincy Adams and you had just been Secretary of State, guess who you expect to be the next President of the United States? That's right, you, John Quincy Adams. So as the election starts, you have these four separate men. But unfortunately, as the election starts, one of these men, William Crawford, suffers a series of strokes. And basically, it leaves him paralyzed and bedridden. He basically just lies in bed and can't move, can't really speak during the run up to the election. And of course, at that point, you probably expect, well, Crawford's probably out of the election. I mean, all he can do is sort of like be a vegetable. I mean, it's sort of funny, but it's really not funny if you're Mr. Crawford, who's basically expected to die at any time and can't move or speak. Of course, Andrew Jackson is expecting to win the election because he's the hero of the Battle of New Orleans, and war heroes who run for president are almost always elected. So, as the votes are counted, here's what happens. Of course, remember, electoral votes decide who becomes president. Now, interesting enough, the guy that got the most electoral votes was Andrew Jackson, hero of the Battle of New Orleans. John Quincy Adams got the second most electoral votes. William Crawford got the third most electoral votes, and Henry Clay comes in last, which must be pretty embarrassing if you're Henry Clay, because you just got beaten by the vegetable, the guy that can't move or talk. Pretty embarrassing. Now, unfortunately, for all the candidates, nobody gets a majority of the electoral votes. Nobody gets over 50% electoral votes. And in that case, if there's no majority electoral votes, the House of Representatives will decide who's going to be president among the top three vote getters. So Jackson, Adams, and Crawford are still in the race to be president. Henry Clay's not. But, and by the way, I can joke about William Crawford a little bit because, amazingly, miraculously, he makes a full, complete recovery from his paralyzation and strokes and goes on to live a very productive, healthy life. Unfortunately, he does not become president, but I'm sure looking back on things at the end of his life, I'm sure he probably thought, well, thank goodness I recovered from the stroke, and thank goodness, I still led a wonderful life even though I wasn't president. But so you basically now have two top vote getters in the House, Jackson and Adams, and the House has to decide. However, even though Clay's out of the running for president, he's still Speaker of the House, which means he has a lot of power in the group that's going to elect either Jackson or Adams. And in the end, Clay sort of jumps in on Adams' side and recommends people vote for Adams, and Adams becomes the next president of the United States. Jackson just becomes really mad. Shortly after Adams becomes president, guess who becomes his Secretary of State? If you guessed Henry Clay, you're right. And remember, Secretary of States almost always become president. So when Adams announces that Clay is going to be his Secretary of State, Jackson says, I knew it. I knew that Jackson cheated. He and that Clay fellow, they made a corrupt bargain. I thought that Clay was my friend. He's a Westerner. He's from west of the Appalachian Mountains. He lives just 150 miles from me. I thought he was just like me, but no, he's a traitor. He's a Judas. He stabbed me in the back. in that corrupt bargain Adams and Clay made against me. That sounds really nice, and people today probably would jump to the same conclusion, but historians have found zero evidence that there was ever a corrupt bargain. From the letters we have and information we have, apparently Clay just thought that Adams would make a better president. And apparently Adams thought that, well, Clay would make a really great Secretary of State and maybe a future president. It just seemed like there was a bargain, a corrupt bargain. So human nature often assumes the worst in people, not the best. And Andrew Jackson is just one example of that. Unfortunately, like his father before him, Adams will just serve one term. Part of it's because of the corrupt bargain, but also because of high taxes. So the new Congress that comes in, basically a Federalist Congress, raises taxes. Oh, Adams has a lot of great ideas. He really does. He wants to create a national university, a university where people from every state can send their students, and it'll sort of be a melting pot of different people from all around the country to trade ideas. That would probably have been a great idea. He wants to build a national observatory to study the stars and help spur science developments, and that'd probably be a great idea. He wants to build lots of roads and bridges and canals, and that's probably a great idea. All of that requires money. And to do all that, Congress raises taxes sky high, so to speak. People don't like their taxes raised, especially don't like their taxes raised a lot, which is why Adams is going to lose in 1828 to Thomas Jefferson. Jackson, by the way, had already had an exciting life before he became president. The Indians called him the devil. I wonder if the Indians liked him. But his troops called him Old Hickory because hickory wood was really tough. It didn't bend, it was really tough wood. And so his troops called him Old Hickory. So his exciting life had begun when he was just a young lad. He had two older brothers. Jackson was being carried, but his father died just after Jackson's mother had the pregnancy. And so Jackson never knew his father. Andrew Jackson never knew his father. But nevertheless, he was born, and his mother had to raise 3 sons by herself on the frontier. So she was known as a very, very tough woman, both physically and mentally, and she passed those ideas along to her sons. Now, when the Revolutionary War comes, all 3 of the Jackson brothers go off to fight, even though Andrew Jackson's just 12 and a half, 13 years of age. His older brother actually joins one of the military units and fights. His middle brother is a courier that runs messages back and forth, and Andrew Jackson volunteers to be a courier as well. Unfortunately, luck does not favor the Andrew brothers. All 3 of them are captured by the British and basically put in what today we'd call a prisoner of war camp. Now, Jackson's mother goes to the camp to try to get her sons out. But even before she gets there, the oldest son dies of a disease in the camp. But nevertheless, the mother arrives and basically talks to the British commander and says, look, I'm pretty good with healing people. You know, I've had 3 kids. I know how to tend to wounds. So if you allow me, I will, you know, be the nurse here at this camp and, you know, and help you British soldiers overcome your wounds and, you know, treat you with the best medical procedures I know of if you release my 2 sons. And so the British commander agrees, but before he can release the 2 sons, the middle son dies of disease too. Fortunately, Andrew Jackson is released, but shortly after his mother dies. So by the end of the Revolutionary War, Jackson is an orphan. No mom, no dad, no brothers, sisters alive. He goes to live with a distant relative and basically sort of works at a general store. and becomes really interested in law. And one of the customers at the store sort of says, hey, this guy seems like he's has a lot of energy and a lot of grit and interest in law, and the guy happens to be a lawyer, so he teaches Jackson some law. So within a couple of years, Jackson becomes a lawyer. Now at this time, you didn't have to go to college to be a lawyer. What happened is that basically there would be the judges in town, the lawyers in town would get together, and if they thought you knew enough law, they would read you in. They would vote to have you be a lawyer. So theoretically, these lawyers, and I believe in Jackson's case, there were a couple of judges involved, would normally test your law abilities. That they would come up with the cases and situations and question you about what laws apply to what. But in this case, his friend who had sort of taught him the law was one of these board members, and he gave Jackson some money. Hey, Jackson, go out and buy some liquor. And Jackson comes back with apparently the right liquor, and they all drink and basically say, congratulations, Jackson, you passed your law test. Didn't really ask him a single question about the law. So Jackson becomes a lawyer and makes some money and starts buying property, and eventually buys enough property to have a plantation with slaves in Tennessee, and eventually becomes one of the largest landowner there. Of course, it's there that Jackson is basically at home on plantation when, and by the way, if you're a rich plantation owner at the time, you're also expected to sort of run, be a member of government basically for free. And so Jackson was the commander of the Tennessee militia, was the general of the Tennessee militia, even though the job didn't pay anything. So in 1812, 13, 14, when Indians were attacking in the vicinity, he was called out, and the militia was called out to go put this sort of Indian raid rebellion down. He did that at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. He was fighting at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend when he got orders from the President of the United States to proceed to New Orleans to defend the city of New Orleans against an attack by the British forces, which of course he did brilliantly, very well, and of course defended New Orleans and won a great victory there. He also by this time had, because of Indian problems, Indians from Florida, which were Spanish, had been raiding the United States. Jackson was given command as militia forces and told to stop the Indian raids. Jackson did that by actually invading Florida and basically taking over every Spanish town and basically raising the American flag over Florida. Unfortunately for him, when you take over someone's territory, that's sort of like an act of war, and the Spanish weren't really too happy of it. The United States had to give Florida back to the Spanish, but because of this incident, the Spanish were eventually going to sell Florida, or give Florida to the United States, in part because of what Andrew Jackson did. So, Andrew Jackson, also known to be sort of a hothead, he meets his wife, Rachel, and they get married, only to find out that Rachel, whose first husband, Rachel thought she had divorced her first husband. Apparently the divorce had not gone through. So technically she was, a bigamist. She had, married. She had two men. She had two husbands at the same time. And of course, Jackson, being a good lawyer and all that, quickly took care of all that and got all the paperwork through. But he became very sensitive when anyone brought up his wife's name in that situation, and oftentimes challenged people to duels. At one point, he challenged someone to a duel, and they went out and paced off the correct paces. And when you challenge someone to a duel, they get to shoot at you first. And oftentimes in duels, what happened, you challenge someone, they came out, and what oftentimes they shot up in the air, and then you turn around and you shot your gun up in the air, and basically it was just sort of a question of honor, and you said, okay, my honor's, been righted, and now we're friends. But in this case, the gentleman actually shot directly at Jackson, and the bullet went into Jackson's chest near his heart. But before Jackson dropped, he shot and killed the other guy that shot him. And for a time, it looked like Jackson would die, but eventually he would recover, and the musket ball was still in his chest by the heart because it was so close. The doctors were afraid that if they, tried to remove the musket ball, they would kill him. And so that musket ball remained with him for the rest of his life. So again, Jackson had led a pretty exciting life before he was president. Now, when Jackson wins, he wins big, and pretty soon he starts appointing a lot of his friends to government jobs. In fact, he fires a lot of government employees and then put his friends in the place. And when some of people start saying, hey, Jackson, why are you doing this? These people that you fired, they're really good employees. They've been on the job for like 30 years or 20 years. And now you're putting, your friends in their place, and your friends have no experience. Why are you doing that? It seems all so wrong. And Jackson said, to the victor belong the spoils. So in ancient times, when your army attacked a town and they won the victory, your army was not really paid. Your army got paid by taking everything from the town, by stealing from the town, and that's how your army got paid. And that was called the spoils, the rich stuff, the loot, so to speak. So Jackson said, I won the presidency, so therefore I should get a reward. To the victor belong the spoils. So he appointed a lot of his friends to these government jobs. Some of the friends weren't too good at them, but nevertheless, he would oftentimes invite his friends over to the White House during the evening, basically, and they'd sit around the kitchen table and play cards and drink, and they sort of discussed the government policies, while they were drinking and playing cards. And of course, again, some people didn't really appreciate that. They thought that was very ungovernmental. That was, not what government should do. That's not how government should operate. But Jackson really liked what he called his kitchen cabinet. It's not like our kitchen cabinet that has food in it. His kitchen cabinet was his cabinet, his advisors, like his Secretary of Treasury and his Secretary of War and his Secretary of Navy and his Secretary of State and his Attorney General. And they sat around the kitchen table and made sort of government policy, which again sort of angered some people. Jackson also disliked some of the things that some other people liked, like the Bank of the United States. So you may remember Alexander Hamilton thought a Bank of the United States would be great. So the money that the United States was borrowing to pay off its debts, they would put that money in the bank, and they would loan that money out to businesses, so businesses could operate and hire more employees and basically help build the economy. But for Jackson, this really just sort of smacked of favoritism. I mean, people accused him of being, putting his friends in other people's places. Those are favorites. But isn't this the same thing, Jackson says? This bank basically gives out loans to basically Northerners, people in New England, who are starting factories and doing shipping and stuff like that. It rarely loans money to agricultural people in the South, like Tennessee, where I'm from. And so Jackson really disliked the bank. In fact, he fought the banks so much. There were many political cartoons today, and this one just shows that the bank was sort of many-headed. That is, the bank was basically in everybody's business because it loaned a lot of people money, and Jackson had a hard time fighting it. But every few years, the bank had to be reauthorized by Congress. That is, Congress had to vote on letting the bank, operate for another 8 years. And because the bank was chartered by the U.S. government. And Jackson's enemies thought the bank was so awesome. In his first term, they actually got Congress to basically pass a law to recharter the bank, even though the bank still had like 3 or 4 years left. And once Jackson believed that you were doing something because you didn't like him, he either challenged you to a duel or he fought back in some way. And in this way, what he did was he vetoed the bank bill. After Congress authorized the bank to go another 8 years, Jackson vetoed it. He canceled it. And Congress was unauthorized, couldn't override the veto. So many of his enemies thought that when the American people realized the bank was going to go out of business, that Jackson would lose the next election, which was coming up in just a few months. So Jackson's enemies sort of planned this because they hoped that either he would prolong the bank even though he didn't like it, or if he canceled the bank, that he would lose the next election. But instead, Jackson won the next election by a landslide, an even bigger margin than he had won the first election by. So people apparently loved Andrew Jackson more than they did the Bank of the United States. And of course, it's somewhat ironic, by the way, that he canceled this Bank of the United States, because if you look at your $20 bill, Andrew Jackson's picture's on it. But Jackson also proved his strength during the nullification crisis, which again, he sort of saw as sort of a battle between him and somebody else and his other enemies, the nullification crisis. So specifically, the nullification crisis was caused when Congress raised tariffs. They raised taxes on things coming to the country. And the North really liked that because it helped their factories, their businesses. It protected them against cheaper foreign-made stuff. But if you're living in the South, like say South Carolina, all the tariff does is drive up prices. And so the people of South Carolina didn't like that. And so South Carolina decides to cancel or nullify this federal law in South Carolina. That is, the people of South Carolina says, well, we're not going to enforce this tariff. We're not going to enforce this tax in South Carolina. All you other states can, do the law and raise your taxes, but we're not going to do that. And one of the major people from South Carolina at the time was the Vice President of the United States, John C. Calhoun. Now, everybody was sort of interested to, hear what Jackson was going to do. I mean, Jackson was from an agricultural state too. He was from Tennessee. Now, it didn't have shipping like the New England states. It didn't have factories like the New England states. It was more, again, of a cotton growing and agricultural area like South Carolina. Maybe he might agree with them. Who knows? On July 4th, Washington's birthday, On Washington's birthday, which was a big celebration back then, there was a big dinner at the White House. And of course, Jackson was seated in the front of the table. His vice president was right next to him. And Jackson took his cup of wine, his glass of wine, and as fancy people are often to do, they stand up and make a little toast, a speech. They say something nice before you have dinner. So Jackson stands up, he looks directly at the vice president and says, "Our federal union, it must be preserved," and takes a drink of wine and sits back down. Of course, what Jackson has just said is, South Carolina is wrong. The law applies to all the states. One state just can't break away like South Carolina was threatening to do. If Jackson enforced that law in South Carolina, they'd actually threatened to leave the United States. Now, it's said that John C. Calhoun was so scared that his hand was shaking, the wine was pouring down. You just have to remember, if you're John C. Calhoun, you've not just been yelled at by the President of the United States. You've been yelled at by a guy who shoots people in duels and kills them. So John C. Calhoun is next up to give a toast, and he doesn't even look at the President of the United States. Instead, he turns to the audience with his hand shaking and says very quickly, "Our federal union, next to our liberties most dear," and quickly sits back down. And then a few days later, he rides out of town. So John C. Calhoun's point was, yes, the United States is important, but there's something more important, our rights as Americans. But if anybody had any ideas about what Andrew Jackson would do, that was soon settled. Within a couple of days, a couple of South Carolina congressmen came into the office of the president and basically says, Mr. President, our people down in South Carolina, they're writing and saying that, if you try to enforce this very unpopular law there, they're going to leave the United States. And Jackson turns to them and says, "You may tell them," meaning the people of South Carolina, "that they may print and utter any threat they wish. But if one hand of theirs be raised in defiance of the laws of the United States, I shall find the first one of them I can find, and I will hang them to the first tree I find. And then Jackson threatens to call out the army, which he said he will lead personally into South Carolina and hang every traitor from every tree he can find. Amazingly, the people of South Carolina decide they don't want to leave the United States. They would love to pay their tax. Mm-hmm. But it does show the strength of Andrew Jackson. Now, as it turns out, Henry Clay in the House, and the new House Speaker as well, Henry Clay, of course, now being in other government offices as well. But the Congress decides to sort of have a compromise, and they decide to start lowering the tariff over a number of years. And so, faced with the threat of force, but also thanks to the compromise, South Carolina backs down in 1832 and does not leave the United States. However, about 30 years later, in 1860, South Carolina would again threaten to leave the United States. But 30 years after Andrew Jackson, there is no strong president to tell them about what's going to happen to them. And 30 years later, South Carolina would leave the United States, starting a civil war in which 1 out of every 50 Americans is killed. But not while Andrew Jackson is president. Jackson also sometimes was criticized for the Indian Removal Act. So during this time period in the South, there were groups of Indians still east of the Mississippi River. Now, of course, originally the Indians were basically all the way to the Atlantic coast, but then comes the first English settlers and other settlers, and eventually over time, many Indians had started moving or were forced to move all across the Mississippi River. But by 1830 or so, there were still 5 major groups of Indians that lived east of the Mississippi River: the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Seminoles, the Creek, and the Cherokees. They called themselves the civilized tribes, especially the Cherokees. So, for example, if you went to a Cherokee land, if you went to where the Cherokees lived, which is at that time sort of in Georgia, and you were in your carriage and you were going down the road, even on a horse, and you looked off, you would see a plantation on either side of the road. And on either side of the road, you see slaves working in the field. And on either side of the road, you see a nice plantation house. And on either side of the road, you see the master of the house coming out dressed in a very nice suit. And you see a nice carriage pull up. And you see that master get in the carriage and start to go down the road. But the only question in your mind would be, I wonder if that's a Cherokee plantation or an Anglo plantation. So the civilized tribes, like the Cherokee, had become so civilized or so assimilated into Anglo society that they too had slavery, and they too had plantations, and they too, for example, the Cherokees had their own newspaper, just like any other American group. They had their own government. They had their own president. They had their, well, called tribal chief, but he was still the president. They had their own Congress, which was elected just like the United States Congress was elected. So they had basically tried to copy what the United States was doing. But to some Americans, an Indian would always be an Indian. Didn't matter what they did or how they dressed or how they spoke or anything else. And that was especially true in Georgia, especially when gold was discovered on Cherokee land. People started coming onto Cherokee land and taking the land. And in fact, the Georgia government then got together and ordered the Cherokee to leave Georgia. They kicked them out. Of course, the Cherokees were so Americanized by this time. What did they do? Did they go on the warpath? No. They did what any good American would do. They sued somebody. In this case, the Cherokees sued the state of Georgia, claiming Georgia had no authority to make them move, that only the United States government could do something like that. And in fact, in the case of Worcester versus Georgia, that's exactly what the Supreme Court decided. Only the U.S. government could make the move. That is, Georgia had no control at all over this Indian group. Of course, Jackson was supposedly to have said, well, John Marshall, meaning the Supreme Court, has made its decision. Now let them live with it. That is, basically Jackson said, I'm not going to help these Indians. And in fact, then Jackson asked his friends in Congress to pass a law to give him authority to use the military to move these Indians out of Georgia to the east, to east of the Mississippi River, to both give him the authority to use money and to use the military as a last resort if they didn't. And so over the next couple of years, Jackson negotiated with the Indians, and eventually many of the Indians did move to the other side of the Mississippi River, either for a land exchange or sometimes because the U.S. promised supplies or money to them. But some Indians, probably about 1 out of every 4 of the Cherokees, or well, probably more than that, probably at least half of them, stayed in Georgia and would not leave. And so eventually the U.S. Army was called out and forced them to leave. Unfortunately, when the U.S. Army arrived, the planning was very poor. They hadn't counted on so many Cherokees being still in Georgia. They also hadn't counted on the severe winter weather that arrived. They hadn't counted on rivers basically overflowing their banks. And so by the time the Cherokees were actually moved from Georgia to east of the Mississippi River in what we now know as Oklahoma, 1 out of every 4 of them had died. And that is oftentimes called the Trail of Tears, because they're crying for all those that they loved and lost in this move. Of course, the Indian Removal Act is still a controversial today. And by the way, it only passed Congress by a couple of votes. I mean, if a couple of votes had changed, Jackson would not have had the authority to move the Indians. And actually, technically, the Indians were moved under the next president of the United States, but Jackson had set it up. So Jackson was a very strong leader, no matter what you thought of his policy, no matter what you thought of his style. If he said something's going to get done, it got done. But he was a very controversial figure. Again, because of his style, because of his, once you became his enemy, you were his enemy, and he basically insulted you and often called you names and plotted against you, and he remembered you, and it's sort of like a grudge match. He loved his friends and took care of them by giving them high government positions. Again, oftentimes people didn't like his policies, which they sort of saw him as sort of anti-Native American. Although I should point out, in fairness, after the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, right before the Battle of New Orleans, when Jackson was putting down the Creek Rebellion, his men brought him an Indian orphan, an Indian baby whose mother and father had been killed during the fighting, and Jackson took that baby home to his wife, and they raised that Indian baby as their son. But nevertheless, his policies to many seemed very harsh, whether it was the Bank of the United States, whether it was the nullification crisis, whether it was the Indian Removal Act. And some of them called him King Andrew. King Andrew. And he was often pictured as a king. And in this picture, he's standing on the Constitution. He's standing on the bank approval. So, and he has a scepter in his hand, and he has royal power. What sort of person rips up the U.S. Constitution and stands on it? Obviously, whoever it is, people don't like him. So this was a political cartoon published by his political enemies. And so hated was Andrew Jackson by at least some of them, they formed their own political party basically just to oppose him, just to hate Andrew Jackson. They called it the Whig Party, but it was basically an anti-Jackson party. So no matter what of course, your life has generally been the last 14 or so years, so your memory as far as presidents go really don't extend back very far, maybe 2 presidents worth. But even my extended memory, there's really, and even the current president no one has been as controversial as Andrew Jackson. Even the current president, I mean, they didn't form their own political party just to hate him, which they did Andrew Jackson. So there you go. He was a very strong leader, you know, the majority of the people approved, but there's a very large minority that did not approve of the practices and eventually formed their own political party.